All right, so let's hit 18.1 here, the civil rights movement. We'll talk about a little bit of the background information or the backstory to the civil rights movement, and then we'll kind of carry it through probably 1960 in that time frame. So anyways, backstory, we talked about the backstory, right? So obviously the Civil War was a lot of people felt that that was a war to end slavery. And although it eventually does lead to that, it wasn't. It was really about state rights. What the war was fought over. But once the Civil War is over, there are three amendments that are passed in the immediate aftermath, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And they all dealt with different issues with regard to civil rights. The first of which is the 13th Amendment and slavery. That's pretty cut and dry. We know what that was, that's no longer obviously a thing after the amendment is passed. Now, you can argue that elements of slavery still existed throughout the South into the 1930s, 40s, and maybe even 50s, and it was in what you would refer to as sharecropping, which basically meant that former slaves, most of them, were still tied to the land that they lived on and in debt to the owners of the land because they weren't allowed to leave because they didn't have enough money to pay off their debts and their loans that they have, been involved in as a result of slavery ending. But that's a story for a different day. The 14th Amendment is pretty crucial in that it grants citizenship, which is obviously an important thing for African Americans, but more importantly here, that it established what was referred to as the Equal Protection Clause, guarantees equal protection under the law. It's one of the most litigated amendments, that we have. Like when there's a court case dealing with, any type of citizenship rights or you were being discriminated against or anything along those lines, typically this clause of the 14th Amendment comes up. And then lastly, the 15th Amendment guarantees African Americans the right to vote. It's probably not worded very well. It guaranteed African American men the right to vote because when this amendment is passed in 1865, women couldn't vote whether you were white or black. A little bit more information regarding that 15th Amendment is that there was a law that was an act of Congress that was passed in 1965, 100 years after this law was actually passed, that, reaffirmed African American men the right to vote because in that 100-year period, especially in the South, a lot of local ordinances were passed throughout, like Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth that prevented African American men from voting, whether it was poll taxes or some kind of proficiency test, whether it's in U.S. history or English language or things of that sort. And all those things were done specifically to prevent African Americans from voting. And that was a big part of the civil rights movement, especially as you get into the earlier to mid 1960s. All right, so why do we use 1954 as kind of a random year? Well, it's not random. There's actually a reason for that. But 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson was a Supreme Court case that was ruled upon, which established what was referred to as a separate but equal clause, meaning that things could be separate as long as they were equal, which doesn't make any sense to most people. It's kind of hard to understand it, but it basically legalized segregation. And again, if you don't know what segregation is, it basically is what the little graphic there is separate, as long as they're equal. Again, you don't understand that? Here's a basic example of it right here. You look at that graphic or that image. Obviously, you see two water fountains there, one labeled white, other labeled colored. By the way, colored was the term that was used back then. Obviously, not an appropriate word that we use today, but you understand historically that's the name that was given to people who were, not white. Anyways, you can see that these quote unquote facilities are not equal, right? This water fountain for white people has a refrigeration system in it. It's obviously very elaborate. This one is very primitive. But if you got through that wall and you looked at the water source, it's the same. When the water comes out, it's the same. It's equal, separate but equal. That was legal. All right. Now, a couple other things that were formed during this time period. 1909, the NAACP is formed. If you don't know what that is, It stands for the National Advancement. I'm sorry, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Again, colored people being the term that was used in 1909. In 1942, CORE was established, and CORE was one of the first nonviolent interracial groups that formed in the realm of civil rights movement. So when we talk about the sit-ins in the 1960s, the training and the origins of that type of idealism came from CORE during the 1940s. All right, so 1954, why did we choose that year? Separate but equal was overturned by another court case called Brown versus Board of Ed. And then you look at it, it says Brown versus Board of Ed. It sounds like Brown, whoever that might have been, was versus a Board of Education. Actually, it was actually a collection of different court cases from all over, the eastern part of the country that all dealt with the same issue, that segregated schools were inherently not equal, going back to the drinking fountain thing, right? So it basically it overturned, as it mentions here, Plessy v. Ferguson, and outlawed segregation in public schools, meaning that all public schools in the United States needed to be integrated. Now, the time frame on that is a little bit kind of up in the air because they didn't give like it needs to be integrated by this date. And certainly, you weren't going to be able to do this in a week, right? Like you couldn't say, all right, Plessy, Brown versus Board of Ed is established. Next Monday, we're all integrated. I mean, there's way too many logistics going on for that. And I'm paraphrasing here. I think the way it was worded is that in a reasonable amount of time. Now, whether that's a month, a year, 5 years, and it differed throughout the country. Along those lines, you can see that even though Brown versus Board of Ed was passed, there were already some parts of the United States that where segregation was illegal in the North. Schools are already integrated in the northern part of the country and some Western states as well before Brown versus Board of Ed is passed. Brown versus Board of Ed was targeted to the South, which you probably could have guessed. Now you can see here there's some other, kind of areas of the country in the purple and the blue that had various forms of segregation or not segregation, but really the North and the South were the thing. And Brown versus Board of Ed targeted these red states. I'm going to pause it. I'll post this video for you to watch. This is not a good platform to watch the video. So we'll move on from that. Emmett Till. Some of you might be familiar with Emmett Till. Let's get my big noggin out of there. Emmett Till was a young boy from Chicago. Matter of fact, I think they put a movie out on him a couple years back that was on TV, where he was going to visit his uncle and his cousins who lived in Money, Mississippi. 1955, right in the middle of the civil rights movement, or starting in the civil rights movement. And he eventually is lost. Like he gets involved in a situation with some Southerners who, a young lady who worked in a store, who he had made some comment to, and there were some conflicting stories, whether he said, "Bye, babe," or "Bye, baby," or he whistled at her, or something to that effect. Obviously, in the South, that wasn't an acceptable type of thing. But he's from the North. He was kind of a free-spirited type of kid anyways. He didn't really understand the culture of the South, even though he was warned by his mom and by his uncle and by his cousins, hey, this is different down here. You can't be, doing all this nonsense. You'll get in trouble. Well, he got more in trouble. He was kidnapped, beaten, and murdered by these two individuals, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, who were, I believe, one was the husband of the lady that he had made some kind of a gesture to, and the other one was his brother. Anyways, they went right to his uncle's house. They literally dragged him out of bed and beat him, killed him, put him in, tied him to a cotton gin type of wheel, type of metal thing, threw him in the river, Tallahatchie River, and he was found a little bit later on, once he was discovered missing. When they found his body was disfigured. and you know, to the point was unrecognizable. You couldn't tell who it was. The only way they were able to identify him is I believe he had like a ring on or something that his mom recognized and said, "Yeah, that's my son's ring," type of situation. You can see the picture of him. This is Jet Magazine, which was a very popular African American publication during 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s. But anyways, here's his mom and Emmett Till there. That's what Emmett Till looked like when he was pulled out of the river. You can see his head here is unrecognizable. Um, and his mother purposely had an open casket when they had the funeral for him for the purpose of identifying, like basically as she's quoted, so the public could see what they did to my boy. And that was published in Jet Magazine. Later on, that picture was published in Life Magazine, which was a very popular magazine at the time. And so the media picked it up, and now was the thing. Now, like everybody is now, what in the heck is going on in the South? These people are crazy. Um, which was kind of, obviously this is not intended to do it this way, but what they discovered was the more attention that the civil rights movement could get from the public, the more momentum they got. The more people were like, you know, why are they doing these things down there? That's not, especially obviously in the northern parts in the northern media. Um, and the southern states try to cover all this stuff up. They didn't want this information getting out. So that was a huge kind of a turning point in when this picture was published. Now, we start to talk about Dr. King and the boycotts and the sit-ins and these type of things that went on, throughout the latter 50s and throughout the 1960s. Um, just kind of ending that story a little bit. The two individuals who were involved in the kidnapping, they admitted to doing it later on after the court case. They were found not guilty because they were being charged with murder. Well, murder is a state charge, and the court case was done locally, right there, in the area of Mississippi. And so, a bunch of white, Southerners are not going to convict two white, quote unquote, brothers of theirs for murder, for murdering a black kid from the North. That just wasn't going to be a thing. So they were found to be not guilty, and that was more publication, more like what the heck. The evidence was overwhelming. Um, moving on here to the next part of this, which is the Little Rock Nine. This was part of that integration period. Again, there's a little video clip that we're going to skip over for this purpose, and I will post them separately or show them to class separately. But moving on to the lecture outline portion of that, these are 9 African American students who were specifically chosen to integrate Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, Arkansas, you wouldn't think of that as being like the deep South. It's relatively moderate in terms of civil rights. You didn't have the crazy Southern militant, redneck type of dudes who were Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Georgia. That was the deep South. Arkansas, not so much, right? And they thought that would be a good spot to try and integrate a school because we have to. This is 1957, and we're 3 years after Brown versus Board of Ed. So that goes back to how I said earlier, that what's the time frame going to be? Well, in Little Rock, it was 3 years. And they were chosen because they had great attendance. They were good students. They represented their community well. They didn't want to randomly pick people because they wanted to make sure that the African American community was well represented by these students. That not all, African American kids were illiterate and couldn't speak and whatever. And so, so these guys and girls were chosen for that reason. The district was obviously very opposed to it. They didn't want black kids in the white schools, even though it was federal law. They kept arguing the thing between, hey, we have state laws and we have federal laws. Why are the federal government inflicting on our state? And public schools are run by the state governments. It's not run by the federal government. So there's a lot of legalities going on about whether they had, the government had the power to do this. Well, they do, because the Supreme Court and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And any law that has, that overlaps between state and federal law, the federal law will take precedent because of the Constitution. So from that standpoint, from the legalities, yes, the federal government had absolutely the right to mandate that these schools are integrated. Once these individuals get to the day they were supposed to start school on September 4th, yeah, they got to school and you can see the picture there, they were literally blocked from entering the school by National Guardsmen. Again, the National Guard is a state-run institution. The mayor of Arkansas, the governor, I should say, of Arkansas, ordered the National Guard of Arkansas to block these kids from entering school. And so that now you have, again, the conflict between state and federal government. And he did it. He said he did it for the purpose of protecting those kids because he didn't know what could happen to them if they got into school. That was a bunch of hogwash. It's not why he did it. He wanted to get reelected, and he knew that taking a hard stance against integration would give him, the support from the majority of the population, not only in Arkansas but from around, that region of the South. As a matter of fact, a lot of the people you'll see in the video, a lot of the people who went there to protest the integration weren't even from Arkansas. They were from Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and other parts of the South. I don't know why that showed up there twice, but it did. Same picture, different slide. All right. So once the National Guard is eventually removed, now we're September 23. We're 3 weeks away. So there was no school being held for 3 weeks here at Little Rock, Arkansas. They wouldn't allow school to even be held, not even for white kids. And then a couple of days after the National Guard is when President Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne. Like we're talking about federal troops, and not just any federal troops. The elite 101st Airborne are very famous, still very famous part of the military, and they were sent in to literally escort the kids to and from school and to and from class. So in this situation, if so-and-so was in class, he was a black student, he was one of those 7 kids, or 9 kids, I should say. There was a member of the 101st Airborne, sometimes 2, camped outside the classroom door, making sure that those kids weren't being harassed or attacked or whatever. Now, those things still happened, but that was how the federal government got involved. Okay, so we'll stop there for right now for the earlier part of the civil rights movement. We'll pick up with this in section 2. Some other elements, lunch counter sit-ins and Montgomery bus boycott, all those things we have to cover yet. That just gives you an introduction to the first part of section 1 of chapter 18.